As you all know, funerary inscription on medieval slabs, whether in Latin or in the vernacular, are barely studied for the quality or specificity of the language they use, but rather for the information they provide regarding the deceased identity and date of death. And everyone who has worked on medieval inscriptions on slabs know that they are quite repetitive. They can be a bit boring, and this is a fact. They look the same, and it can be quite difficult to bear with a large amount of them. But such a focus on the content of those texts from medieval epigraphy is induced by the formulary features of most of the inscription, which mostly use prose and recurring expression to give precise and efficient data and to ensure the identification of the tomb and celebrate the memory of the deceased. In this paper, I would like to address few inscriptions that show a different prosodic choice and use verse compositions, poetry, to describe or evoke the deceased and to elaborate on the limitation of human life and the promise of the resurrection. I intend to include inscription on slabs into the realm of medieval literature beyond the use of formula and expectedness. And for this purpose, I will focus on verse epitaph engraved on funerary monument, mostly slabs, I hope, produced in France between 1150 and 3050. But let's begin with a strange example, and I will now share my screen. Pierre de l'Étoile is the founder of the Benedictine Abbey of Fontgombault, and which is founded in 1091, and it is also the first abbot. And he died in the very monastery we are in the center of France in 1140. His funerary monument, as you can see on the screen, is today located at the west end of the nave of the Abbey Church, and it's here not in its original display, as you can see on the photograph, but it has been installed here for conservatory reasons. And you can see it's a trapezoid slab, about 20 centimeters thick. And the lower part of the tomb, you cannot see it, but it's very roughened. It's not really sculpted. But the upper side presents a funerary effigy of the abbot in bas-relief. It's interesting because he's depicted alive, holding a staff and a book, and with his index finger pointed at the book. The effigy is presented on the limestone monument without a frame or architectural or ornament border. It occupies the entire monument and only the sculpted bevel, making the transition between the horizontal surface and the vertical edge of the slab encloses the image of the deceased. And this is precisely here where we will find the epitaph for Abbot Pierre with a very simple writing, and you can see that the inscription completely encircles the effigy. The lettering is oriented toward the outside of the slab, and the text begins here at the feet of the deceased. The inscription is therefore read by moving counterclockwise, beginning at the bottom of the monument, which is a rather unusual way to proceed. The text formed the following funerary inscription. As you can see, the inscription limits the biographical information to the names of the deceased, the status of Peter, which was the abbot of Fontgombault, and the importance of this effigy among the community probably guaranteed the identification of the tomb without the need to draw up a full portrait of the deceased. The name of the deceased opened the text, Petrus, and associate both the stone and the image with the abbot with identity immediately disappears. The rest of the inscriptions give way to the juxtaposition of two funerary topoi, which are very common in epigraphy between the 10th and the 12th century. The first one is the image of dust that you can see here, sine nomine pulvis, which is interesting because it brings both biblical and liturgical harmonics to this formula. The second topoi is built around the variation quod sum eris, you will be what I am, which is frequent in funerary inscription of the 12th century. The text for Peter, however, adds to the traditional address to the passerby with a specific request for prayer. Say God, be with me. With this formulation, the living person does not have to anticipate his future by looking at the tomb, but to mobilize his voice to ensure the salvation of the deceased who calls him out throughout his effigy. The liturgical dimension manifesting the belief in the resurrection of the body in the first topos is duplicated with an invitation to acknowledge the end of the world in an original sequence of injunction. The funerary monument for Pierre de l'Étoile is original in various aspects. First, it is one of the oldest known funerary effigies located on top of the actual burial. It installed a substitute image of stone body where the dead body of the abbot is concealed and hidden within the grave. The famous tomb of Abbot Izarn at Saint-Victor in Marseille, dated 1048, precedes that of Pierre by almost a century, but tombs presenting a funerary effigy to signify the buried body are almost non-existent in France before the middle of the 12th century. The situation is different in Germanic state, for example, with earlier effigies in bas-relief also interacting with funerary inscription. It is true that representation of the deceased can be found in commemorative installation for the same date, but they are often dissociated from the burial itself. And here I want to take the example of the funerary monument for Abbot Bégon, who died in 1107, installed in the cloister of the Abbey of Sainte-Foy in Conques, and which depicts the deceased with Christ and three angels in the wall under a funerary arch. The dates generally attributed to the monument of Pierre de l'Étoile in the middle of the 12th century therefore make it one of the earliest examples of a three-dimensional funerary effigy located at the burial site. The second originality comes from the arrangement of the epigraphic text at the edges of the funerary monument. As the wonderful Estelle Grand-Varenne, who might be in the virtual room today, has shown in a very important article, it was not until the 11th century that inscriptions are placed around the edge of the tomb slab, instead of using the flat or curved surface of the tomb as a writing space. She mentioned several Carolingian examples showing this type of epigraphic display. By the monument for Abbot Izarn, where the body of the deceased is covered with a shroud of letter, praising his merits and virtue, maintains the funerary text immediately over the effigy. The displacement of writing to the edges of the tomb is difficult to understand in its motivation and chronology, but it could be possible to link it to the introduction of a center-based decoration, whether effigies or ornament on the funerary monument intended to adorn the tomb. Writing would thus become the periphery of an iconic center, the margin of the image. Estelle Grand-Varenne refers to a Norman tomb dating from the middle of the 12th century, for which two sides of the lid, decorated with plant motif, are framed with a long funerary inscription, complex in its construction and vocabulary. This epitaph does not frame an effigy, but an ornamental decor, but has chosen the periphery of the monument to be displayed as if it was the expected written space for a funerary text. This hypothesis in which the epitaph was moved to the edge to make room for engraved decoration only offers, however, a partial explanation, since early monuments, especially those we can find in present-day Germany, show funerary inscription placed on the edges of rectangular slabs with no decoration at all and a perfectly blank page in the center of a slab. And this is the case, for example, for the red sandstone slab preserved in Einhard Basilica in Steinbach. The inscription in verse runs all around the slab and invites the reader to pray for the deceased buried under the lid without knowing the name. It's interesting, we neither know their name nor their image because there is no effigy on this slab. It is possible that it has been left unfinished and that it misses its effigy, although this rather seems unlikely. The Steinbach inscription would, in this case, reinforce the shape of the slab and, by extension, the location of the burial site. Elsewhere, the striking monument for the priest Bruno made around 1200 and now preserved outside of the south apse of Hildesheim Cathedral, shows a rich decoration in high relief in the center of the slab. The epitaph is placed on the edges, building a large inscribed arch exalting the presence of images, but other inscriptions are placed horizontally on the writing stripes separating the sculpted register, or on the book held by Christ in the upper part of the tomb. This is the complex arrangement indeed, and this is the beautiful piece, I have to say, and one which does not locate the text into the frame of the effigy, as noted at Fongombo for Pierre de l'Étoile, but which testify to the flexibility of inscription in their occupation of different writing surfaces on the tomb. These changes in France as in Germany with the rise and popularity of inside slab with effigy, what we will call the platombe in French. The disposition of the epitaph at the edges of a slab using an epigraphic strip running around the circumference of the tomb became the standard location for inscription from the 1230s onward. The tomb for Pierre de l'Étoile represents a head start in this process, and this is why it is so important to study epigraphic practices. To this exceptional feature, writing at the edges of the tomb, must be added the fact that the memory at the abbot of Fongombo has been carefully staged on this grave by placing a verse inscription around the effigy. The inscription is made of 4 hexameter, the current most Latin verse consisting of 6 metrical group of syllables, showing correct construction with no specific rhyme scheme. The originality does not come from such a use of verse for a funerary inscription. On the contrary, versification is common for this type of text until the beginning of the 13th century. It is the means of composing both original and topical inscription to emphasize the morality of the deceased. And here I take only one example of this large metrical inscription in funerary context, with one of the first inscription composed for Saint Anselm of Canterbury, who died in 1104. And you have here an 8-verse funerary message, similar to what can be read in Fongombo with the use of the 2 same topoi. The originality of the slab for Pierre de l'Étoile does not therefore come from the versification of the inscription, but from the choice of verse for an inscription located in the margins of a funeral effigy. The use of verse inscription for funeral slabs never overruled the number of texts in prose, but is common for the monument dated to the 12th and the first half of the 13th century. The development of inside slabs with an effigy and a funerary inscription is parallel with the impoverishment in the diversity of this epitaph. This is not a matter of standardization, but one should acknowledge that the more generous format of funerary monument goes with more homogeneous textual composition, which in their immense majority choose prose, open with the tumular formula like ikiaket or ikrequiescit, limit their content to the name, status, and date of death, and the pious wish for the salvation of the soul of the deceased. And this is what you can see in the major collection of platombe, of slabs, whether in Burgundy in France, or in the west of France, or in the north of France either, but also in Germany, in the Low Countries, and even in Galicia, in the Iberian Peninsula, where you have a lot of these objects. The stabilization of epigraphic display at the margin of the effigy must be considered as the tendency in the epitaph available until now, but it should be constantly nuanced and specified to understand why such impoverishments happens for epitaph in an epigraphic context which from 1250 onwards knows simultaneously and paradoxically an unequal diversification of epigraphic forms, language, contents, display, and function outside the funerary domain. Why do we have this kind of formatization, standardization in the funerary domain? This is the question I would like to address. Inscription on funerary slab seem to correspond to the formal rigidness of the position of the image within this frame on the surface of the tomb, with a simple model, a frontal effigy staged by an architectural structure, a sort of chapel in reduction, accompanied by the elements marking the passage from life to death, the clothing of the eyes, the accumulation of objects and symbols, the presence of angels. Everything surrounded by a single, sometimes double epigraphic strip, emphasizing the quadrangular shape of the slab. The content of the text replicates and complements the iconic information presented by the effigy. The simple, almost obvious model, which signals and signifies the burial site and the identity of its occupant, presents innumerable variation in form and content that foster the tension between the familiar and the exceptional in the corpus of medieval effigy slab, a tension which is felt by all scholars when dealing with this infinite series of documents. And here, obviously, Paul Cockerham did an amazing job by showing this tension between models and variation. The use of model displays on effigy slab, simultaneously recognizable at first glance and unique in their detail, leads to a confusingly expected and unexpected approach to the monument. And here the use of a specific display of writing or imaging make it possible to distinguish a specific object from its series, to move from the generic toward the particular, in fine, towards the individual, from the community of the dead exposed in a series of slabs in a local or global context. Given the number of verse inscriptions for slabs reduces from 1250 onwards, and that the use of verse is limited to inscriptions which are not inscribed on slabs or leads, but dated from the tomb, it is possible to argue that the use of verse on effigy slabs is one of the means of creating distinctions, of generating a common document, placing the deceased in a privileged position of commemoration. Epigraphic texts for the Middle Ages attest that verse inscription cannot be associated with a particular function, content, or layout of the text. And this is something that is very frustrating and which is proper of medieval practices. You can find everything in every single place, which is make inscription absolutely unpredictable. You cannot predict anything about inscription just by their form. And this is a free and unbound practice of writing. But it seems, however, that verse tend to follow some linearity in the inscription, and it tend to display a kind of verse unit onto a line unit, whether horizontal, vertical, or circular. The underlying idea being to make poetry visible before being legible. And here we can have many examples. Here I show an example from Poitiers, where you have a composition which is in elegiac distich. It means a long verse, followed by a shorter verse. Here in the disposition, you can see that we have blank spaces in both sides to show that we have here a short or shorter verse. In the elegant inscription commemorating the death of sailors in Saint-Victor of Marseille, dated 1144, the structure of the text does not only respect the line-verse arrangement for the poem, but also mark the caesura, the rhythmic break in the middle of the verse with specific punctuation. Thus, the voice of the poem, the poetry itself, becomes visible. And also at Saint-Hilaire-le-Grand in Poitiers, the funerary inscription for Constantine, dated at the middle of the 12th century, despite its great graphic quality, propose a very compact text in which verse continue from line to line, only separated by traditional punctuation. However, when effigial slabs becomes the most common funerary monument in the first quarter of the 13th century, verse has traditionally displayed in line following the prosody, one line, one verse. It is therefore surprising that the possible segmentation of the poem into the four-line vector is not used more often for inscription on the margin of the slab, showing an already segmented epigraphic stripes. In the survey undertaken for this paper, there are no verse inscription in neither Latin nor in the vernacular that show a segmenting display on the slab. It means that you can follow the poem one line in each segment. Verse inscriptions span from one side to the slab to the other, and this corresponds to the unlimited linearity of the slab and to the syntactic continuity of the text, rather than to the ontological segmentation of the verse. It means that there is nothing in the epigraphic display that allows the visual identification of a verse inscription on a slab. I will take here one example to show this. This is the epitaph for the abbot of Saint-Ouen in Rouen, Nicolas de Goderville, who died in 1273. It was engraved on the margin of the now lost slab on a high quality, and it ends on the strip located of the broken arc, crowning the architectural composition on the surface. And I will show a detail here of where the text ends. And what is interesting here is that you have the verses written around the slab, and the conclusion of the slabs of the verses are displayed on this arch. But the last word is written here, tanti. So there is nothing that can recall the display of a specific poem, but you have the sensation that the verse structure is visually lost in the shape of the funerary device. It drowns it in the same way as the deceased identity disappeared behind the accumulation of laudatory and impersonal adjective. It seemed that the same dissolution of poetry into the visual and textual arrangement of the slabs also affects text in the vernacular. And I will just take one example here, which is a very famous example. This is the epitaph of a knight, Olivier de Machecoul, in the great abbey of Villeneuve near Nantes. And here, the omnipresence of complex punctuation signs that cuts off sentences and words, it breaks the continuity of the text, and it disturbs completely the display of the poem. You cannot see that you have a poem here. And the syntactic contents of the verse must be experienced probably in the composition, probably in writing, but moreover in his patient discovery when the writer and the reader are physically engaged and challenged to recognize the specific feature of the verse epitaph. If the display on the slab does not distinguish verse text from epitaph in prose, at first glance, you cannot know if you have a verse or a prose inscription around a slab. What about the content? The inscription for Pierre de l'Étoile, as we have seen, juxtaposes two formulae which are very common in the epitaph of the Central Middle Ages concerning the transience of earthly life and the disappearance from the material world. The inscription for Abbot Nicolas accumulates laudatory adjective in an eulogy, or what we could call a planctus maybe, and the inscription for Olivier de Machecoul takes up the themes of the brevity and the fragility of life. The content of verse text on the slabs does not seem to differ from contemporary funerary inscription in verse or in prose inscribed on other funerary device, freestanding plaques, or tombstone. And we could compare, for example, what we have in this inscription still in Les Sorinières, which has an amazing collection of slabs for the Middle Ages. And this is the epitaph for Alix de Troyes, who died in 1221. And we have here a very simple verse inscription that are praising the quality of the deceased. But if we take a closer look, we see that we have exactly the same vocabulary, the same tone, and the same general understanding of what poetry could be on inscriptions that are not located on slab and that are not surrounding effigy. And this is the case of this very graceful inscription for a provost named Raymond, who died in 1282, and it's now preserved in the Museum of Carpentras in the south of France. And which is interesting here is that we have the community of content between the text from Alix, for example, and we have the simplicity of the dove that is used to describe the deceased, his generosity towards the poor. And you have here formula that seem to travel in poetry regardless the shape of the inscription. And the thematic similarity between these inscriptions testify to the circulation of funerary formulas independently of the media and the links between inscription and burial. They also show that the use of verse, however exceptional it might be on slabs, is not intended to drastically exclude the verse inscription for the larger clusters of funerary text. They do not create a specific register of language, nor invent poetic images linked to the presence of the funerary effigy on the center of the slab. So they're different, but they're not that different. The unexpected, therefore, is not so much in the content of the text, but in the use of verse itself. This is undoubtedly the reason why slabs show a significant number of verse inscriptions that at first sight are quite, let's say it like that, shaky or blurry and challenge the rule of prosody. And this is not a phenomenon reserved exclusively for slabs. It is among those texts that what we could call error or flaws are more common. But I will just take an example. This is the inscription written on the slab of Abbot Vincent Antebert, who died in 1285, and who was buried in the choir of the Abbey Church of Notre-Dame de Valmont, near Rouen, once again. And what is very interesting in this inscription is that you have the sense that the poet tried to write a poem, and he borrowed a lot of pieces of formulas and tried to arrange them in a coherent composition, but it doesn't work. No scansion is possible if following a classical metric standard. The haphazard placement of the text inside the architectural frame of the effigy is the evidence of a problematic layout, as if the text has suddenly become too long for a conventional placement in the margin of the image. And here, this is rather a question of monumentally displaying the poetic intention of the commemoration by breaking the expected pattern of a slab inscription. So they try to do a real long poem displaying many formulas that you can find elsewhere, and they try to build it in the format of the slab, but it didn't work. It failed at some point. And what remained, it's not the possibility to appreciate the real tone and the real taste for the poetry, but only to see the distinction between the intent and the result. And here, the poetry is here to arouse the aesthetic and undoubtedly spiritual interest of those engaged by the composition, writing, or reading of the text. And this is what I call the verse pretension, trying to do poetry. This verse pretension is necessary to move from the familiarity within the shape of the slab toward the commitment to the text and the commemoration. Such a pretension leaves traces in the text by the insertion of a verse sequence in the heart or at the end of a prose inscription, whether in Latin or in the vernacular. So we have a prose inscription, and at some point we put verse sentences just to show that the verse can fit into this model. And this is, for example, the example with the slab for Méeux du Chastelier, dated to the end of the 13th century, which is now kept in the Musée des Antiquités in Rouen, once again, which another amazing collection of slab. And you can see we have very, very carefully, finely engraved slabs show the deceased with her hands joined together and a figure displayed under a three-lobed arch. And the second part of the inscription is both in Latin and in verse. The first one is in the vernacular, but the second one is in Latin and in verse. And it begins immediately after the vernacular on the right-hand side of the slab and continues on the lower left-hand side. It forms a distich addressing the reader, and it invites him to consider the fragility of his fate. As you can see here, who you see this stone, why do you not, despite moral things? Indeed, every man is enclosed in a similar home. These two verses are a common formula in funerary epigraphy from the 13th century, particularly in the south of France. but is never directly associated with the burial or with an effigy. The slabs from Meur du Chastelier comes from an ancient church of Saint-Lô in Rouen, and the verse formula is exceptional in this context. It does not appear elsewhere in the northern half of France, nor has the text been found in elsewhere with comparable epigraphic tradition. If its theme is not surprising at all, you can expect that on a tomb. And if its content is perfectly adapted to the device of the effigy slab, which shows the effigy of the dead, the use of this Latin metrical formula on the slab is undoubtedly singular, as the imagery of the coronation of the ornament, as you can see, it's a beautiful image, shaping a distinguished monument that must be the result of a specific commission. It breaks with the obviousness and the conventional rhetoric of an epitaph, beginning with the expression, "Here lies," because it is not obvious anymore. It slows down the rhythm of the language, both its writing and its reading. The inclusion of the distic "qui tumulum cernis," as you can see here, is a means of challenging the seriality of slabs, of creating variation within conformity. The recourse to verse is, in this sense, the equivalent for the text of the complex and unexpected arrangement of writing on the surface of a slab, using, for instance, book, scrolls, and changes in the textual orientation. It is a means of suspending the flow of the inscription by proposing a new and more complex form of writing and reading. I think that some poetic engagement tend to provoke a pause in the staging of the epigraphic device. However, all verse inscriptions on this type of monument do not stop at an impression of poetry, and they can go quite far in the quality of the verses. The text composed after the death of Abbot Jean de Thau in Jumièges in Normandy in 1282 is inscribed in the margin of his effigy, and it presents a great formal and lexical quality, and it testifies to an ability to manipulate and create formulas in an original poem in 4 verses. I did not write down the poetry here and the metric analysis of the verses, but here you have something of really amazing quality. The arrangement of the text around the slab reflects the attention paid to the harmonious composition, both in the content and form. The limited use of abbreviation and the location of the word amen at the end of the line show that the topical hemistic is a half of a line of verse, prudens fuit atque fidelis, was not used to fill in a seemingly incomplete epigraphic text, but rather to paint a complete verse portrait of the deceased. And you can see here that the name of the deceased has been reduced to this initial with the letter G here. And what you have to imagine is that what you have in the verse is the sound of G. It is used to follow the prosody at the risk of totally hindering the identification of the abbot. But this is the sign that the sponsor of the inscription has fully entrusted the care for commemoration to verse. He gave everything to poetry, as if poetry was able to take charge, to take into account the real purpose of commemoration. But those verse inscriptions were not exclusively intended to hinder reading. On the contrary, epigraphic texts show that the use of verse cannot be opposed to a provision of precise funerary information that breaks topicality and poetic expectation. The poetry is not always the synonym of the reduction of the information you can find. In this respect, inscriptions on slabs are no different from the contemporary verse documentation with mixes, sometimes within the same text, expected formal structure and detail concerning the life and quality of the deceased. And I will just here share one example with the inscription for Hugues d'Arc, which was the abbot of Saint-Bénigne in Dijon. who died probably in the first year of the 14th century. And this inscription is not very fragmentary, but it's kept in the museum in Dijon, and it's also known through a drawing. But you can see in this text that we have two apparently contradictory aspects, because we have a lot of precise elements about the life of the abbot, and a huge amount of topoi, especially the association of the deceased with illustrious figure of Roman antiquity, which is the topos of all topoi of funerary inscription. But here you have the both poetry has taken into account the two aspects, the topoi and the personal detail about this inscription. In the layout and this content, this inscription disrupts the homogeneity of the epigraphic landscape at Saint-Bénigne de Dijon, which is once again a great collection of slab and inscription. And this inscription for Hugues is very different from what you have within this corpus. And we could argue that it is a question of denoting the singularity of the deceased. Whatever it may be, this singularity, we have very few biographical elements for this abbot. But throughout the singularity of the layout and the prosodic choice, in the desire to signal something different, poetry becomes the rhetorical means to stage the unexpected. On the slab, it suggests a way of writing that needs to be discovered rather than a voice which would expose itself in the obvious image of a poem. And one last example comes from Saint-Bénigne-Dijon and concerns the abbot of Flavigny Nicolas, who died in 1262. I don't know if I have it. Yes, I have. His slab is now lost, but it was in the cloister of the Abbey of Flavigny. Instead of an effigy, it shows a large abbatial staff. The prose text begins on the right-hand side, goes around the slabs, and then continue into the center of the slab, parallel to the long right side on two additional lines. The text presents a prosodic structure, expected and contemporary slabs, like you can hear. The first part takes up part of the liturgy of the dead. Following the pious vow, 4 verses are engraved according to the same arrangement in the length of the slab. The first 2 verses compose an extended prayer request with common metrical formulas. May he who brought Tartarus save the one his slabs cover. You who read this pray to God, may the Lord bless him now. On the other side of the staff, 2 verses move from the funerary topicality towards new information about the deceased. Born in Beaune, he then became a monk in Dijon. He was vigilant in his action as a monk. Contrary to what can be read in the inscription for Meilleur du Chastelier, for example, the switch to verse at the end of the epitaph is not a mean to close the text with a universally applicable formula, however original it might be. Verse here is unexpected, both is in location and content. Moreover, the stonecutter did not respect the line-verse correspondence. It was not therefore a question of filling in the center of the slab with verse after the unplanned engraving of the second line, for example. The whole composition was carefully planned, verse by breaking the expected obituary or tumular formulation, allows the most important information in the text to be emphasized. And this is probably no coincidence that the stonecutter chose to place his signature at the heart of the poem on the slabs, right against the abbot's staff. The metrical inscription serves as a privileged system of writing. It is the ornament of the content as understood in the Middle Ages. Ornament is an index of singularity, an accent in the narrative, and a testimony of linguistic efficiency, whether visual or textual. Medieval visual culture defines its norm and trends, considering its ever-present ability for transgression. The grotesque, the obscene, the hybridity, the metaleptic, the incongruous are always possible. From exception, these phenomena can become types. For surprising, they can become expected. If it possibly arouses surprise, discomfort, or shame, transgression is mainly used for two reasons. First, they have the capacity to make the image reflect on itself and to question its nature, its limits, its function, and ultimately the extent of what is visually possible when representing the unspeakable. Secondly, they have the capacity to arouse in the designer, as well as in the spectator, the intellectual affectation of the search, of the quest, and to move the gaze beyond the image. The unexpectedness of the image is both to do with its shape and what comes from a discovery beyond the form. And it is normal that you have no slide now on the screen. I should have precised that. Sorry about that. If expectedness and transgression can, at the end of this survey, be defined in a general way as a linguistic operation authorized by verses in the corpus of medieval slabs, the evidence in Burgundy shows that local context provides the key to read and understand this text. Transgression can only be considered as a fact when it springs from a norm, a tradition, a constancy, to be sought in local epigraphic habits, in phenomena of workshop, or serial production in the circulation of form. And I have chosen to keep the neutral term of unexpected to describe the effect possibly caused by the spur of verse in the ocean of prose, because documentation demonstrates that the authors of the inscription did not seek to oppose verse and prose, or even to make them two diametrically distinct forms of epigraphic culture. Similarities in the themes, lexical fields, scriptural references, the introduction of obituary or burial information show, on the contrary, that different expressions of language were applied in the formation of an epitaph, and above all, into the creation of a text written directly into the slabs, made it possible to display the memory of the dead and of the living. Within this graphic solidarity, the use of verse singularizes and connotates metrical epitaph, which in this unexpected discovery and in the slowness it requires, reduces the distance between the epitaph and the effigy, and the reader and the deceased. Verse is the intimate of funerary inscription. The inscription in verse participates in the ornatus of the funerary monument, the adequacy of the dignity of the deceased. It distinguishes it from the uniformity of other tone, the recourse to verse, which is rarer and less expected, presupposes the existence of an epigraphic otherness. Insofar, the composition, however formal, however greedy for topoi, must always make choices to personalize the inscription. To do this, it must either restrain verses to usual formula and thus create what we can call a prosimetre, mixing verse and prose, distinguishing by its very formal existence the epitaph. Or it must go through the original composition of verse, integrating at least the deceased names into prosody, leading to a minimalistic disruption of the syntax, which is not necessarily the case with prose. The study I have conducted has revealed that there are no known texts that can be traced on a funerary slab that take a complete formulary or a poem. Verse is what we could call the unique of funerary inscription. Both intimate and unique, the verse inscription on the slab possesses the halo effect that has been identified by Alfred Gell for the technological practice of art, aroused by three elements: the objective quantity of knowledge and know-how mobilized in the realization of the work, the measurable virtuosity of the artist or craftsman in the creation of the remarkable, and the social and distinctive value of creation. Gell analyzes works that have no relation whatsoever to the funerary art of the Central Middle Ages. But the example considered in this lecture nevertheless responds to the collateral concept of enchantment, destruction of routine and series, fascination for the object, bringing into play the affect, and prestige of the interaction between the object and its actor. The place of the verses on the extraordinary tomb for Hildesheim Bishop Hadolog, who died in 1190, and which was to be kept in the crypt of the cathedral, testify to the unexpected, unique, and intimate status of the verse inscription in contact with the funeral effigy. Of the 4 texts beautifully engraved in 4 distinct locations on the tomb, 3 are in Leonine verse. The first one on the book recalls in an elegiac distich the precariousness of the earthly life. Worldly fame wither, respectable beauty fades, I birth disappear, I cried out silently. The second verse, over the arch that encloses the head of the deceased, identifies his burial place, praises his merits, and recommends it to God in 2 hexameters. Here lies Bishop Adelog, a pious man, a wonderful and kind person. God, accept him among the blessed. The third one, on either side of the body, mentioned in an elegiac distich the administrative and liturgical action of the bishop. He acquires the taxes from Aesel, brother, forgive those who confess their sin, and God have mercy on them. Only the text on the arch in prose give the date of Adelog's death. Verse text literally encapsulates and highlights the image of the deceased. They do not constitute a margin or an edge, but are acting as a presentation casket. Matrix is a framework for writing in medieval epigraphy, but on most of slab, poetry become an actual visual and material frame for funerary effigies, and I will close now. A comprehensive study of the use of verse inscription in medieval epigraphy has still to be done for the 13th century onward. It should reveal specific form and function of poetry that might differ from what is already known for the early Middle Ages. This paper today has offered some insight regarding verse inscription written on slab. It has shown that poetry is able to break the expected pattern of funerary inscription and to emphasize specific aspects of the portrait of the deceased or the liturgical disposition, for example. Poem on slabs are epigraphic solutions for patrons to create original funerary monuments, promoting the memory of the founder and benefactor. On too many occasions, verse has been regarded as the easy way to compose funerary inscription by quoting and copying formulas and recurring expression. However, when they are displayed on the commonmost monument, where prose is becoming the norm during the 13th century, verse inscription testify to the creativeness of the epigraphic actor in the making of distinguished lieux de mémoire. Thank you very much for your attention.